And what he believes is that we don't actually interact with reality as it is truly with our senses at all. That what we're interacting with is something akin to a like VR headset or computer desktop. It's the same reason that a user interface is friendly for a person who knows nothing about computers, right? Because the thing that looks like the trash can functions like a trash can. The thing that takes you to the internet says internet, well, I was going to say Internet Explorer, but what is this, like 1999 or something?
Shout out, IE.
Google Chrome or whatever. This, like these icons that look like the thing you want to do, right?
Yeah.
And his argument is that this is what reality actually is, because we don't need to know the ontological reality of what it is we're interacting with. We need to survive.
There's a lot of mystics on the internet. Shout out and much love, you crazy fools, that could use dusting off a textbook or two, warmly, without judgment. And secondarily, there are certainly a lot of scholars in academia who would be well served by eating a mushroom. So I'm trying to bridge those two worlds. I'm Bob Peck, and this is Karmic Relief.
My background is in documentary film and comparative religion. I wrote a book called Original Sin is a Lie, How Spirituality Defies Dogma and Reveals Our True Self.
It's an interview show where I talk to spiritual teachers, activists, scholars, people that live within these traditions and also appreciate the overlap. What happens when you start to get activated internally, that makes you activated in a compassionate way in the world. I'm thrilled to be talking to fantastic, inspiring human beings. I have to do much less work, which is nice because I'm just asking them questions about their story. It's a life hack.
Hi.
I hope you'll enjoy these explorations, these really excavations. In the ones I've filmed so far, they've all been really beautiful and deep and lighthearted. So please enjoy Karmic Relief. I'm Bob Peck. I wrote Original Sin is a Lie, and now I'm asking a bunch of questions to intelligent, compassionate humans.
Michael Phillip is talking to people. Hundreds of fascinating philosophers, academics, psychologists, scientists, and crazy mystics on his show Third Eye Drops. He's helping to untangle esoterica in the Western world. And one of the most important discoveries he's made is that philosophers are actually mystics. Plato, for example, has been framed by history as a man who understood reason and the world in a secular, grounded way. This is true in some aspects, but if we haven't read the Timmaeus, we're not fully appreciating how mystical and how esoteric Plato truly was. There's a reason that cave metaphor inspired the Matrix. Michael and I talk about how we got into this world of podcasting and esoterica, as well as touching on a few of our faves, from Plotinus to Jesus to Jung. Enjoy, here in Austin Public and Eastside.
I was so mad when I first saw your podcast name that I did not think of it.
Well, thank you.
So
I'm glad you enjoy it.
I hate how good it is in the best way. You are... Who are you? We're friends.
You forgot?
Yeah, I forgot who you are. Third Eye Drops podcast explores big questions about consciousness, reality, and the mystery of existence. Over 6 million downloads, and that's probably from like a 4-month-old website update, so it's probably bigger than that. Michael Phillip has interviewed hundreds of extremely deep thinkers, and he's joining me here today. Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome, man. I'm excited to riff.
Who were you? What happened? And who are you now?
You know, it's weird because, in a sense, like, so my dad I just turned 40, and my dad for my 40th birthday actually put together this like extremely thoughtful photo album. And it's surreal.
So sweet.
When you look back at yourself as a young kid and these different times in your life, and you think I think to myself, like, who, like, literally, that seems like another person. That seems like another lifetime. But what does not seem different to me is there's been one kind of, I feel like, fundamental quality that has been with me forever. And it really is that nebulous sense of, for lack of a better term, like seeking and questioning. Because I do remember from being very young, like having a sort of critical eye toward these like cultural baskets that people would spend all their time in, like the jobs people would do, the churches people would go to, the relationships people would have. And I would ask myself, like, why do people do this? Why do people do that? And I remember as a kid having this almost like, I'm sure you've heard how they call Socrates the fly of Athens or something like that, because he would just like annoy people with questions. And I kind of feel like I was like that as a kid. I would ask my dad, like, why do people do this? What does this word mean? Why do people go to this church? And you sort of figure out slowly that often there's not a good reason. It's just sort of what's there, and it's what opportunities are available, or it's just what people do. And that like kind of terrified me as a kid. And I honestly,
Stimuli response.
if I had to boil it down, I think that's kind of who I am. I think it's coming from that place of, I don't understand why people do this. Like, can you help me understand why people do this? And then that you get somewhat better concepts and mouth noises to express that curiosity through. And then you sort of start to realize, okay, I see myself like, have I told you the James Hillman tree thing?
I don't think so.
James Hillman.
Shout out James Hillman.
Yeah. The late, post-Jungian psychologist, author, best known for the book Soul's Code, also founder of archetypal psychology. But he used to talk about figuring out what tree you're on, philosophically speaking. So like if you were on a tree and like you're a limb, what like intellectually speaking, what branches are next to you? And for him, his answer is basically my answer. Like, James Hillman's here, Jung is here, Plato is here. Like, right, these are the people, the thinkers next to me that resonate. And I feel like do the best job of both providing some epistemological guidance that also comports well with reality. Like the lived experience of reality, and in the case of like Platonism and Jung, really does seem to accurately portray reality. So
they do a damn good job.
Yeah. And now I've rambled beyond your question.
No, this is a podcast.
It's true.
That was a really good answer. Yeah, curiosity is kind of a word that comes up in what you were saying. And it's funny because I made that, I read Leonardo by Walter Isaacson and made a video about how like insanely curious Leonardo was. And he finished like, I think 15 paintings, which is like Picasso painted like 2,000.
Right.
Like Leonardo painted almost nothing. But what he did, pretty good. And it's because he was just obsessed with 19 different areas of life, and was not surprised that you commented on that, and it, resonated with you in terms of Leonardo as a curious person, you having a podcast, you reading Richard Tarnas's epic work, which we should get into.
Yeah, for sure.
It makes sense. I think what was interesting to me in kind of researching you for this show, despite us being buddies, is bachelor in journalism.
Yeah.
What was that process of kind of going from bachelor's in journalism? I know you worked in tech. You're kind of like me. Like you had some bad jobs.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I knew I did take a lot of philosophy classes in college. I took like philosophy of religion classes, Eastern philosophy classes. But I knew I needed to have some kind of skill coming out of school. And I knew that I, technically speaking, didn't want to go into like a super analytical field or anything like that. So I was like, I'm a decent writer, like journalism seems like an obvious choice. So, and it does, I don't regret that choice at all, because it does kind of help you learn to parse information and think critically and like question sources and like why people are saying what they're saying. But I've never worked officially in journalism. Like doing a podcast is the closest
It's
thing.
pretty journalistic.
I guess it is.
Can
like,
be.
I would say the other thing that made me want to do it is I grew up playing in bands, and this may not sound related at all, but there is definitely a sort of like, if you're not going to go the traditional journalism route and you're going to go the internet journalism route, which was already starting to emerge when I was in school, you need to have this sort of a DIY ethic. And our mutual buddy Corey Allen was talking to me, and him were talking about this yesterday at lunch. And this is a bit of an aside, but I think that DIY disposition toward creativity is the difference between people who will be successful and who will make excuses and never do anything. Like if you come from that world of like figuring out how to do it yourself and not allowing technical or any kind of roadblock to stop you from doing something, like I think that is one of the biggest determining factors in whether or not you'll ever be successful or even start. Like, I mean, look what you're doing here. Like, you're doing this because you're doing it. Like, no one can stop you because
there's no one behind these cameras.
There literally isn't. And that is so important. That's so important, man. And I think that even though journalism doesn't directly relate to that, now it kind of does. Because if you're not going to, like I said, if you're not going to work for a traditional media company, you got to figure it out yourself.
Which are embattled by layoffs right now.
Sure.
Hundreds of journalists are getting fired from big rags.
For sure.
Because of the artificiality of
so
intelligence.
So I think it was that. It was just, I need to do something. And I'm like a decent writer, and I have like, words flow. So I guess I'll do that.
You do words good.
Thank you.
Which I've told you many times. And you get comments too in your thing, like on our latest one, you said, what was it? Esoteric ranch or something that you're going to drizzle all over something.
It was like, I might have said that about Gnosticism.
About the
because
Gnostics.
It's like the word that you just throw it in. Why not throw Gnostic over the top of that?
You can just add in Gnostic to like kind of anything that's like internal esoteric mystic.
Yeah, it's psychedelic. That's Gnostic. It's like any kind of not unnormal spirituality. It must be Gnostic,
Put it on a salad. Put it on pizza. Put it on
brother.
A sandwich, an esoteric one. And like half the comments on that episode were about your use of the word ranch. But no, it's funny. Journalism, philosophy, film, and religion.
Right.
So
same thing.
That's why we're buddies. Cool. That's all I have.
I wouldn't be surprised if I've been rambling for an hour already.
Third Eye Drops. Who are some of your favorite guests and why? And let's talk about them.
Man, it's really hard to answer that question because I truly enjoy having like close friends that I've like that I can just flow with on the show. So like my friend Godzi, who's coming here actually later today. Those conversations seem to resonate with people. They resonate with me a lot personally. Anytime I can get into like a flow state where I'm exploring ideas that, tickle the wonder whiskers, I'm happy. So I do love conversations like that there's just very little barrier to entry. And I know that we have a similar sort of suite of ideas flowing through our psyches.
You don't have to research anything.
Right. Like
hardly.
I have I'm talking to Godzi after you and I talk right now. I have no idea what we're going to talk about, and we just go in and do it. So I always love that. But I also love, some of the more academic thinkers I've had on the show, like Dr. Don Hoffman. And I mean, we could easily talk for the rest of this time about like his insane.
Let's go into him. I think what impressed me you've interviewed him multiple times.
Yeah, I think like maybe a half dozen.
Which is pretty rad. Don Hoffman is a PhD physicist.
Not a physicist. He's a cognitive scientist.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Don Hoffman is a PhD cognitive scientist.
Yeah.
And he is on the level. And what really impresses me about the pods I've listened to of yours with him, the latest one mainly, is that you're really hanging with him.
It's taken time. It's taken time to hang with him.
It took the sixth
But yeah,
episode.
I mean, just getting a grasp on the basics of what he's proposing is pretty brain melting.
Which is this new science of consciousness, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's such a blanket term.
Yep.
But can you piecemeal an accessible framework for us?
Yeah. So most people already, I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people watching this already have this sort of sense that we're not seeing reality as it is with our senses. So Don Hoffman, just to put a little more detail on his expertise, PhD from MIT, was a career-long cognitive science professor at UC Irvine, and human cognition and perception is his specialty, and he's written technical, thick books on
brain mapping,
how we're apprehending reality with our senses. And what he believes is that we don't actually interact with reality as it is truly with our senses at all. That what we're interacting with is something akin to a VR headset or computer desktop. And the reason for this is that it's the same reason that a user interface is friendly for a person who knows nothing about computers, right? Because the thing that looks like the trash can functions like a trash can. The thing that takes you to the internet says internet. Well, if I was going to say Internet Explorer, but what is this, 1999 or something?
Shout out, IE.
Google Chrome or whatever. This these icons that look like the thing you want to do, right?
Yeah.
And his argument is that this is what reality actually is, because we don't need to know the ontological reality of what it is we're interacting with. We need to survive. So evolution by natural selection actually rewards us for interacting with the world on a base of what are called fitness payoffs. So you look at a steak, you know that's going to give you the nutrition you need to survive. You look at a train, you know that thing's going to kill you if you step in front of it. So we interact with reality, the greater reality that we're totally ignorant of, on only that level, the level of not perceiving it as it really is, but as we need to perceive it so that we survive and we can, continue the species, essentially. And the way that this isn't just an idea, he comes to this conclusion through things I don't understand, like evolutionary game theory, simulations, and hard data on how processing happens. And this is what he calls the desktop theory of perception. But then he also, so to your point, where does consciousness come into this? So he believes the truth, he's an idealist, so he believes that consciousness is the fundamental reality behind those illusions I was just talking about, those, evolutionary fitness-based illusions. So what I love about him is he's using evolution by natural selection in an inside-out way against the people who are normally proponents of that theory, right? Which would say, we're just living in this mechanistic, reductionist, physical reality of mutations and organisms and DNA and whatever. But all of that is part of the illusion to Don. Literally everything we see, and this goes all the way out to the most meta possible level. I've been rambling for a while.
He stumbled. Yeah. No. I mean, this is you're very clear. He stumbled into being a mystic, essentially. And some of what you're talking about reminds me of, there's a really great book by Robert Wright called Why Buddhism is True, which is an excellent title. Original Sin is a Lie, and Buddhism is True. And there's nuance to all that. But he basically makes the case that he's a behavioral psychologist. And he makes the case that, the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, for example, around, it's not quite desire is suffering. That's kind of a bit of a generalized mistranslation in English. It's more around kind of outward clinging is unsatisfactoriness, is a clearer English
Right,
translation.
and that's typically like the dukkha part, right?
Right. That's the 1 and 2 are kind of desire leading to the suffering of this world, and he frames that in the view of evolutionary psychology and behavioral psychology, where the hunter-gatherer nature of our past, 100,000, 200,000 years of this kind of survivalistic, really Sisyphean is a word that I overuse, in terms of you're not going to find it out here in this external seeking. And the fact that Don, I guess we're calling him Don now.
He that's what he'll ask you to call him. I
diverse.
mean, he literally is the most, if not the most, one of the most intelligent people I've ever spoken to in my entire life. And he is extremely down to earth, extremely like gracious with his time. And he'll ask you to call him Don. Yeah.
He's what a king. The fact that he's, come to similar conclusions studying brainwaves for 40 years that the Buddha came to under the Bodhi tree, is profound to me. I think what's interesting about Don as a kind of spiritual commentator, is that there was kind of this opportunistic circuit of spiritual teachers in the last 30 years, probably, forever, but definitely of the last 20, 25, no shade Deepak, but
Right.
basically what he's a pretty decent example of someone who was like, see, quantum physics proves spirituality.
Right.
And that's not fair to
Yeah.
physics and scientists who've spent their lifetime studying this stuff. And then, even though I'm not crazy about the word, it's loaded, but there is an appropriation quality in some spiritual teachers with science. And so I want to be really careful there. And that's why in Original Sins of Lie, I have a science moment. I mean, it's very thin as not a scientist. But now you have Don Hoffman, you have Bernardo Kastrup, who you've also spoken to many times, who are doing a really incredible job of speaking to the secular fam to say, no, these mystics aren't actually as crazy as we thought.
Yeah, for sure. And Don, what I also love about him is he has a very low tolerance for bullshit. Like if he is like, no, that's going too far, or that's,
he will correct you.
Yeah,
on
yeah.
some stuff.
And I love that because what he's proposing is he knows, and I want to be completely clear about this, is incredibly extreme and incredibly against the grain, but is also the most intellectually and mathematically rigorous thing you're ever going to read. Unless you're going around reading like technical, like things that are published in academic journals for other PhDs. Like that's the level of sophistication in what he's talking about. He has several like peer-reviewed published papers on this. Like one, I think the most recent one is called Fusions of Consciousness. And I tried pretty hard to wrap my mind around that before I talked to him. And I didn't even appreciate the implications of it until he really outlined it for me. But the other major piece to his theory that I didn't directly say yet is that I started to talk about it, but behind that illusion, that evolutionarily convenient illusion, is what he calls the realm of conscious agents. And this realm of conscious agents, he believes, is this truer reality. And it's like, imagine if instead of reducing reality down to bits of matter, you're reducing reality down to bits of consciousness. And that at some basic level, there's this network, this unified network of conscious agents that are, and it's so mystical. It's so non-dual. It's so platonic.
Sounds like Ramana Maharshi.
Because
friends.
it's literally like this unified field of conscious agents, yet they are somehow individual and hierarchized. And it's like it's literally, I mean, we haven't talked about this yet, but it's literally like what they're talking about in Plato's Timaeus, because they talk about,
sounds Gnostic and
right.
yeah.
Like, I mean, so in the Platonic creation story, when they're talking about soul, psyche, they're talking about how there's essentially this primordial cosmic animal. And the primordial cosmic animal is truly alive, and it is the cosmos itself. And the cosmos itself is this hierarchical, proto-archetypal being that has within itself the possibility of all other beings. And that sounds exactly like what Don is talking about. Like you have this logical yet conscious, ensouled, it's really like almost a transcosmic being.
Ishvara comes to mind in Hinduism, which is like the active power of the god in the world. Like Brahman is beyond the curtain and inactive in the world. But then the Ishvara is like the godhead, kind of the active.
Cool.
And there's a million variations in Hinduism, at least, but that's, you know, put it frame it however you want. You know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I really strongly suspect, I would like to get more into Indian, I know like the basics of Eastern philosophy and the basics of like the metaphysical picture of like the yogis and the Upanishads and stuff like that. But I would like to know it as well as I know the Platonic now.
Come on in.
Because I feel like it would just be like, yep, this is this, this is this. It's like one to
I think
one.
it would be really humorous for you to just continually run into more. And kind of same with me with the Platonic. Like we're kind of foils a little bit. And it's just because I'm so hypnotized by, you know, really Yogananda, Ramana Maharshi, and Ramakrishna, you know, Neem Karoli Baba. I've just read all the guru stories, and
I love that shit too, man. Like
they're terrific.
Yeah, and it's crazy because for whatever reason, and I think it really is a conspiratorial reason, I think they neutered the Western mystical tradition by turning Plato into like a philosopher in the modern sense, where he's like this kind of proto-scientist mathematician guy, and it's not that mystical, and
he's kind of Aristotle's
slightly more trippy, you know, forerunner, and
Aristotle's kind of the father of biology, right? And
he's the one who really, you know, the Aristotelian way of looking at reality in this more empirical way, where you're breaking things down into these like, you know, phylums and like spreadsheet consciousness, right? Like he's the father of spreadsheet consciousness, or that's how he's portrayed a lot.
Right.
But man, if you look at the life of all these major Platonic philosophers, it's indistinguishable from like a yogic mystic. Like I was just listening, I talk about this podcast all the time. I'll talk about it again.
Let's do it.
The Secret History of Western Esotericism. It's this podcast by this PhD classicist who specializes in, you know, esoteric history.
Schwepp.
And Proclus is probably like the last great Platonic sage, lived in like the 400 AD-ish. And he's got miracles all over his bio. Like he went to a place where it was having this extreme drought. And I don't remember how long it was. And he used some magical implement called a Yunks, which I don't even know.
We don't know what it is.
I couldn't figure out how to spell it. So I was like trying to Google it yesterday. I'm like, how do you spell Yunks? And yeah, he used this thing to petition the deities, basically, and he made it rain. And it's not written about in his biography like it's like maybe he did, maybe it's like he did it.
Yeah.
You know, it's literally like these guys all have like like Plotinus. Did we talk about the do we ever talk about the whole daimon thing with him?
No, but there's a really great book called History of Mysticism by Swami Abhayananda, which covers East and West.
Yeah.
And it's like kind of like 4 or 5 page bios on like all the most interesting humans, basically, to me. And Plotinus is like way in there.
Oh, yeah.
as a Neoplatonist.
Yeah, he's often considered like the father of Neoplatonism, and we have a lot of his writings from Porphyry. So, like, if you look up the Enneads, it's like this multi-volume, crazy compendium of his.
Porphyry's Plotinus's kind of main student.
Yeah, he was a student of his, and then he was the one who really captured his teachings and stuff like that. And he is a mystic. I mean, he's straight up talking about, withdraw the senses from the outer world. Like, that's the illusory world. The truer noetic reality is like, you're connected to it, but you've got to undo the stains of the outer world and like go deep inside, and then you'll see what real beauty is, and you'll, be walking with the gods, basically.
The capital O1.
Right. Yeah, the one is the sort of ontological ground level first cause of everything in the Platonic world. But so anyway, this story about Plotinus's daimon. So this is a belief from the ancient Greek world that we all come into this world with this guiding spirit that they call the daimon. And
that's unique to each individual?
Yes, each individual has, and today the closest allegory is like the guardian angel, but we think of that as sort of this silly idea.
Mm-hmm.
But in the Hellenistic culture, it was a pretty, seriously taken idea that you have this guiding spirit attached to you. And you could do rituals, apparently, to summon this daimon forth and have it show up. And you had to have a very ritualistically pure place. And the only place was, I forget where he was. I don't know if this was Rome or I can't remember. But it was an Egyptian temple of Isis. And this like really high-ranking priest was like willing to do this ritual to bring Plotinus's daimon forth. And I'm like, why am I telling this story? I'm like, because it's another example of these like highly thought of philosophers that are actually like mystics and sages. So they do this ritual through whatever, means. And apparently it's like this way higher ranking being than a daimon that shows up. So then they're all like, this is why you're such a great teacher, because like you are connected to something godly. Like you don't have like a normal person
run of the mill
spirit
daimon
with you. You have like you have like something godly with you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Chills. That's Plotinus?
That's Plotinus. Yeah.
Okay. And what's so fascinating too to me about the Hellenistic world, which is when they're operating.
Yeah, and I'm using that broadly. Like I'm not talking about the Hellenic. I think the Hellenic age is like a specific time, but I'm talking about the broadly Hellenized.
The broadly
world.
Hellenized, that period and that area, because there's so much overlap. It was like that was the first time in global civilization that, a Greek philosopher could pop over to Egypt. And, even Alexander the Great had an Indian yogi teacher 300 years before Jesus. So, like,
what's the scoop on that?
Well, Alexander conquered the world at the time, as like a 23-year-old. And they invaded India, and they were pretty impressed by some of the rishis that they met. And, I can't remember his name. I'll throw it up on the screen. But it's like a funny, like, Greek-ized name of an Indian name. And, that was like 300 years before Jesus. There's hypotheses that Jesus went over to India in the lost years, which I write about.
Plotinus too.
Wow. Okay, cool. I mean, it's not crazy. It's like there were trade routes that were established. The most compelling case for that is, well, one, there's allegedly, it's called the Hemis Monastery, which is allegedly has documents that have some evidence of his stay there and stuff. I don't make a case. I don't necessarily make a case, but there's a great monk and Swami named Abbot George Burke who's written a book called I think Jesus Lost Years in India. Anyway, OCOY.org goes into a lot more rigorous research about the potentialities there and the evidence that we have. But what Yogananda says is the Magi, for example, the wise men in the nativity scene, in Matthew it actually says they came from the east.
Right.
And Yogananda's going, That's India, friends. The idea is that when the avatar is born, when a very, very, very high being that's divinely connected is born, other tuned in homies travels to go honor it, and he kind of repays that in his teenage year. He repays the honor of these distinguished rishis that came to kind of honor him. So anyway.
Yeah, and that's definitely throughout the whole Greek and Hellenic tradition. That seems to be an understood idea. So the Plotinus thing is there was some like war type thing going on, and he supposedly joined some group because he wanted to go study like the Eastern wisdom, and supposedly did. And it seems to be
hop on a wagon,
right? But it's like no one knows for sure like what that means or where that is. But there is this general sense that like there was this real source of because even back then they believed that there was this like true Sophia, this true wisdom that ran throughout, that was perennial, like a perennial philosophy that existed in these Eastern Brahman mystics and these Egyptian, Middle Eastern, obviously Chaldean, like the Chaldean oracles is another major inspiration for these thinkers. So they understood that this was something that there was ancient wisdom from all these different cultures. And yeah, that's so interesting.
But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light, and no one comes to the Father except through me, Michael.
What do you think that was? Obviously, you're saying that ironically.
I am.
But I'm always curious, like, what do you think the esoteric hermeneutic on that phrase is? Because that's one that's always cited, right, by somebody who's trying to preach exclusivity.
55% of my comments are John 14:6.
Of course.
By Christians.
Right.
Well, you can read more about it in Original Sin is a Lie, out now on Amazon and Audible. Just kidding. But not. I spent years on that thing. There's a few things that I say about John 14:6. The first thing is that the Gospel of John, there's 4 Gospels in the New Testament. The Gospel of John is it's the 4th Gospel written, like absolute consensus. It's much later than Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Mark is around 70. Matthew is 70 to 80, 85. Luke is 80, 95. John is absolutely 100 to maybe even 120 CE, AD, CE. And Jesus is killed in 30 to 35, 33. So even Clement of Alexandria, who was an early church father, was the first person to say, who's very well respected, was the first person to say, John is the spiritual gospel. It's referred to as the spiritual gospel. And it has some gems. It has some bars. It has some Gnostic ranch drizzled on there.
That's also the one that people argue is actually a Christianized version of the Bacchic or Dionysian mysteries too, because that's the one where he turns the water to wine.
Yes. Yeah. And the noose is, there's no nativity in John. So the Logos, and it's extremely mystical. It's very overlappy with Gnostic themes. Really cool thing is he says, that's where he also says, you shall all become sons of God. You shall all do things greater than I. I mean, it's very it delegitimizes the exclusivity thing in the text. But also that line, so that's John kind of as a whole. Additionally, when he's speaking to the disciples, he's going to use highly spiritual symbolic language. When he's speaking to the crowds, it's blessed are the poor, it's very direct and literal. But when he's speaking to the disciples, it's different. And he's speaking to the disciples when he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And also right before that, he says, before Abraham was, I am, which gives me chills. It's like, that's a mystic master talking. He's not talking about this body, this man is this thing. He's talking about the unity conscious
Logos.
The Logos, the I am. Before Abraham was, which is the founder of Judaism.
Or maybe more accurately, nous. Maybe that's more of a It always depends on whose version of logos and nous you're
the
using.
word.
But those are like some of my favorite concepts to. Yeah.
It's an extremely Platonic Hellenistic idea. And then the other thing that I say to it, kind of beyond the Christian tradition, so that's like John, it's like spiritual, symbolic, it's all these things. It's not just this one dude saying exclusive, this is the only way. And then, beyond that, plenty of teachers make I am statements. It's not that unusual when you read the world mystic traditions. Buddha says, I am awake. Krishna says, I am the fire on the funeral pyre. I am the sacrificial rite of the, when you dissolve the individuality of the ego,
Right.
which I haven't done, you step into that level of understanding, and you can speak from that to the folks that understand what the hell you're saying,
Yeah. Yeah. And we talked about this in the first pod you and I did on my show, but this starts to get to why esoteric teachings are important. Because if you're not initiated into the lineage of ideas in a sequential way, where you go from uninitiated to neophyte to et cetera, then you're coming into these ideas without context, and you take the wrong things literally, or you extract the wrong meaning from the message.
Right.
And that's where there's this weird tension, because I don't think either you or I would like to have this like exclusivist elite spirituality.
Correct. Yeah.
Yet it also has to be intellectually rigorous and rooted in like a gradual understanding of concepts on top of one another, or you're robbing it of its profundity. And that's why one of the many reasons why I'm interested in these like now lost mystical traditions or initiatory traditions, or like mystery cults or temples or whatever, because I think probably pretty likely that Jesus was initiated into something like that too, because many teachers were.
There's a hypothesis that he was an Essene.
Right.
I don't disagree, but I don't make that claim myself, but I'm open to it.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about like that part of the world that he was in or where he studied to know like what was around him. That's not not that I have a specialty, but that's
you
definitely
do.
not it.
No, you absolutely do.
I have a specialty that I created that is like yeah.
Well, you have another specialty, which is this guy from Austria, which we'll get to. But
What is
I mean, not Austria. God damn it.
I'm like, you're trying to say I like Hitler or something?
No, this guy, Switzerland. Jesus' period, the first century Judea, was extremely tense.
Yeah.
They were sick of the Romans in Jerusalem and all up in their business. There's a lot of different groups that are forming. The Zealots are kind of the most famous vigilantes and mercenaries. They eventually take over Jerusalem. The first Jewish revolt happens in 68 to 70 CE, and it's brutal. They kick out the Romans, and then the Romans come in and siege the city. And they destroy Jerusalem. They level it, basically. They destroy the temple.
Yeah.
And so that's the environment in which early Christianity came to, was like this kind of lead up to that. And then the actual Gospels themselves, Paul is killed right before that. Paul's writing and traveling in that period leading up to the temple's destruction and Jerusalem's destruction. And then the Gospels are written immediately after. So it's just this extremely tense. I mean, it's an apocalyptic period. There's all this apocalyptic language in biblical text for a reason. And the Essenes are often the caves, expecting the war of light and the war of darkness. And so that's what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, is kind of their apocalyptic take on that period. Then there's a second Jewish revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt is, I think, 130, something like that. And they think Bar Kokhba, who's a Jewish warrior and leader, was the Messiah. His followers. There's a bunch of messiahs.
Isn't there someone right now who's supposedly
There
like
always
a Jewish
is.
Messiah? Because so I was driving down the street the
You
other
don't
day,
worship him?
and I don't even know which one we're talking about. But yeah, there's some. I'm guessing it's like a Hasidic or Orthodox Jewish Messiah. Like I saw a billboard for it, and I was like,
Oh,
"What?
shit.
I don't know what this is." But
I follow him
meant
on
to look
Instagram.
into it. Yeah, I'm sure you follow many. I'm sure you follow many.
No, but did you see that there was a really good Vice doc about 15 years ago about the Russian Jesus,
No.
Siberian Jesus? He has a cult in Siberia. There's this guy, I think his name's Michael,
Perfect.
but he looks just like Jay
Oh wow.
as a Russian version.
Mhm.
And he's in there there's like 5,000 people living up there in Siberia, and he's their god to them. And he was like a security guard. It's hilarious. Anyway,
Wow. I'm curious how you, as someone who's more into biblical scholarship by a long shot than I am, how do you interpret and what do you think about like the apocalyptic kind of prophecies? Because there's people freaking out right now about like the red heifer sacrifice and all that stuff. Like, are you following that?
no, but the
Oh,
eclipse
man.
stuff was
the-
big.
I'm really surprised you haven't heard about this red heifer thing.
I
So like
haven't.
so the red heifer has something to do with like there will be a red heifer sacrificed, and that's going to lead to like I believe it's like the next iteration of the temple. And when that iteration of the temple is built, then that is like one of the main demarcation points for like the beginning of the end times. And there is literally a red heifer. So there's all these rules. Like it has to be perfect. It has to be this kind of cow. It can't have one hair that's like any other color. It can't have been there's all this. It can't have been yoked. Like there's all this stuff. They found apparently 2 or 3 of these cows in Texas. And they have been sent to Israel. And there are people that are going to sacrifice these red heifers ritualistically, apparently. And this is like on mainstream news, like mainstream TV news. They interviewed like the guy who has the heifers and stuff. So maybe not that specifically, but well, yeah. What are your thoughts on that? And also, what are your thoughts on just in general, like? Do you see that allegorically, or do you see that as actually attempting to like mystically predict a literal end time?
My ignorance of what you just said and lack of awareness is a pretty good answer for where I'm at with all of that. And partially, even just Bible scholarship aside, I mean, real quick, I'll say the book of Revelation is where this is most apocalyptic. That's where it all comes from, mostly. There's a couple things Jesus says, which I'll get to, but the book of Revelation is much, much, much later. We're not really even sure who the author is. They say John the Evangelist, whoever that was. Certainly not an apostle, and certainly not John the Baptist or John the Apostle.
Or Jesus.
Jesus didn't write anything.
I think that's important to say, because as obvious as it is, I think there's a lot of people who have some idea that like somehow Jesus wrote the Bible.
And what's funny is he didn't even speak in the same language that the Bible was written in.
Right.
He spoke in Aramaic, which is a different language than Greek, which is the first version of every text in the New Testament. So there was a translation that took place before it even got to the written form. But it's infallible. The book of Revelation is pretty hogwashy to me, and that's what... There's a Wikipedia article on apocalypse predictions.
Right, and how many there have been. Yeah.
There's been, hundreds, probably, at least, that are documented, right? So thousands. And it's just a great comedy of the human mind. And I think, to me, more it gets like psychological in that it's the human ego. Not the Jungian ego.
Well, I was going to say this might be a good opportunity to get into Jung.
Yeah, we should, which is like this fear or love. Like there's a in A Course in Miracles, which is a Bible to me, as you know, and a mystic masterpiece. There's this idea that there's really only 2 choices between any moment of our existence, and that's fear or love. everything's derivative from those two roots of action or thought. And that's just the fear thing, is to say it's about to come, it's about to change, it's about to end. And to kind of answer the earlier form of the question, Jesus, in my view, was a mystic master. I even am happy to consider him a non-dualist. If you read Gospel of Thomas, which scholars even consider to be the fifth gospel, which is much earlier than John. Many scholars, there's a debate. To be fair, there's a debate.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any of those Gospel of Thomas riffs memorized, but you dropped a couple really good ones during our Gnosticism chat, and I was like, this is good stuff.
Thomas's bars, and it's very early, and most scholars have it contemporary with the Synoptics, the first three. Some scholars even, including Dominic Crossan, who is like Professor Emeritus, I think, at Rutgers. Probably wrong. But anyway, he's one of the most well-respected Bible scholars in the world, and he believes that it's probably earlier than the Synoptics. And it's non-dual, meaning not two, meaning unity consciousness, all this kind of perennial philosophy across the wisdom traditions. I believe Jesus was a non-dual mystic master, and so when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven will come, he's not talking about the politics. So I disagree with Reza Aslan's big book called Zealot.
Yeah, Zealot.
Which is that, and there's kind of this almost like progressive activist kind of reclaiming of Jesus as a political revolutionary.
Yeah.
And I don't think that he was apolitical necessarily. He famously flipped the money changers tables in the temple.
Well, he certainly ran afoul of the powers that be.
The state wasn't crazy about him. But yeah, he was an esoteric mystic master. So when he's talking about the kingdom of God, Luke 17:21, he literally says the kingdom of heaven is within you. The word is entos in Greek, which means in, within, inner. And so, yeah, it's all silly to me, really, the apocalypse stuff. And I really don't pay any attention to it. It's mostly comedy, and I get to smile and laugh when the next one is disproven.
Yeah. I think the major, the other obvious major thinker that I'm into for people that haven't ever heard me ramble before is Jung. And
isn't Freud from Austria?
He might be, yeah.
Okay, that's why I thought that. I'm sorry.
Jung
is a Swiss man.
Yeah, Swiss German. Admittedly, I should know more Freud, because as much as he gets sort of cast aside by people who are more, I guess, mystically inclined in favor of Jung, he really is the father of psychoanalytic theory and ideas like the subconscious and even the shadow. And though his idea of what the shadow was different than Jung's. But also,
and he wrote
Dream. Yeah, he was the first one to take dreams seriously, though again from ultimately a different angle than Jung. But yeah, I mean, without that, would Jung have been the person he was? But from the Jungian perspective, you could see this as a humongous example of like projection, right? Like, you personally are always on the brink of a personal apocalypse that could come at any time. And you conflate that with this meta apocalypse based on all of these different inherited cultural and philosophical and religious ideas. And therefore you're like projecting this sense of very unique and personal justice and, culturally relevant justice that you have out onto the world. And that's what that's what you could say that a lot of these false predictions of apocalypse is like an individual who is so brined in this religious way of thinking that they convince themselves, like in this kind of hall of mirrors way, that this is what is about to come to pass. And then, as you've pointed out, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times it has not come to pass. So and this isn't why I'm into Jung, but it's just like an interesting tie-in to this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great transition to him because he's such a revolutionary. And like, I think what's really, we were talking about this last night about Carl Jung kind of in explaining it to a friend, his work goes from, he really does take the baton from Freud in psychoanalytics. The early stuff is great, kind of unlike most of my tastes, which I prefer the early stuff.
Right.
Like Inner Speaker is better than Lost in Yesterday.
Right.
Tame Impala's discography.
Mm-hmm.
The early stuff. Carl Jung, the early stuff is good, but the later stuff, baby, now we cooking.
Yeah, for sure. Like anything toward the end there's two things he does toward the end that are more appealing. One is that he starts writing for more of a general audience and really starts thinking about his legacy and realizes like a lot of my writings are either shrouded in incredibly deep, esoteric, rambling and or incredibly dense scientific and psychological ideas that
kind of the middle period
are not going to be like read by the masses or understood well. So I probably should have a memoir, and I'm going to do that. And I probably should do Man and His Symbols, which he does with a couple of other adjacent thinkers.
And so early, just for context for anyone listening, early stuff, archetypes, subconscious, dreams.
I don't know his entire collected works.
And then we get, and psyche and so on. And then we get into, by the end of his life, he's writing Gnostic, our favorite word. Literature.
Well, even way before the end of his life, because the Red Book was written like
kind of middle period.
Way,
actually, 1910, I think. Something.
Yeah, like the 19. Yeah, I should know the exact date, but I don't remember it right now. But yeah,
you've read it and I haven't. So
he writes this directly after his schism with Freud, who was his, as you pointed out, was at one point his mentor, and he was like set to take up the mantle of his whole
Freud was
theory.
Pretty bummed out too.
And yeah, Freud was disappointed, and it greatly impacted Jung's career. Like he lost really prestigious speaking appointments at, I don't remember what university, but major university. And then he goes into this soul-searching period where he's not quite sure where he's going professionally, what his own theory is going to be hinged on. So he goes on this series of just like endogenous trips, what would later be called active imagination, where he starts communing with archetypal figures and figures from myth and is like searching for his soul and, basically goes in these like underworld journeys.
Journey of awakening.
Where it's like full-blown mystical stuff. And the most mystical of all is he has this series of just a few nights where he's hearing literal voices and is literally like thinking there's like people at the door. And like a voice comes to him saying something like, "We're from Jerusalem and we are not satisfied." And it's commanding him to write. So he just starts writing and writing and writing. And that mystical writing ends up becoming called 7 Sermons to the Dead. And he says that it's written by Basilides of Alexandria, who is this famous Gnostic teacher from 1st century CE,
Second.
roughly? Second? Yeah, who's this
very prominent Gnostic teacher,
and heavily Platonized, mystical teacher. So Jung writes this strange Gnostic story about how the masses will largely be reabsorbed into this kind of like cosmic obscurity, this like pool of soul called the pleroma. But the ones who follow the principium individuationis, who follow the principle of individuation, they will fulfill the plan of nature and they will become as distant stars, he says. So this is the kind of stuff he's writing like early-ish on in his life. Like he's not that old at this point. And he buries this stuff. Like he doesn't publish it for his entire lifetime. And it's not until like 2008 or 9 or something like that it eventually gets published. But
just dropped.
Yeah, but he did he did publish the Seven Sermons to the Dead under the pseudonym of Basilides of Alexandria. So it's like he's into this stuff while he's still a respected scientist and before he's going really deep into the esoteric stuff. But then after the Red Book period, he starts going deep into alchemy and like bringing alchemy into the psychoanalytic theory and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Very well put. And you know, you told a really great story of his too. I want to ask you, can we come back to the tower? Because you know more about it than I do.
Bollinger Tower.
Yeah,
that he
the Bollinger
built?
Tower. You just told East Forest Krishnos a great story of his with the sun's penis.
Oh, sure.
Tell that story. So Jung also, another term that he invented is synchronicity.
Yeah. As far as I know. Yeah, some of these things that he's like famous for, I don't know if he actually is the first person to use the word or if he just made it famous. But yeah, so Jung is inventor of, if not associated with, synchronicity.
Glitch in the matrix.
Right. Which is, it's essentially a coincidence that seems to transcend the boundaries of your mind in the physical world. Like, you
irrationally,
know, low-hanging fruit example, you're driving, you're listening to a song, and the moment you hear the word in the song, you look over and there's a license plate that says the exact word that you're hearing. Like that, you know, that's like a simple version of a synchronicity or some version of that many people have heard. But yeah, Jung has this experience early on in his career where he's a psychiatrist for anyone that doesn't know. So he's, you know, seeing all these schizophrenic patients, and one of them is like looking out the window and he's rambling something about the sun's penis causing the wind. And Jung is like, you know, he doesn't write these people off. Like, he was really interested in like, what is it? Like,
what
are these
that?
people tapped into that having these schizophrenic visions? Where is this coming from?
It's great imagery.
So it's weird enough that he remembers it. And then years and years later, he's reading some mystical text, or it might have been an alchemical text, I can't remember, that's talking specifically about the sun's phallus and how the sun's phallus like waves and causes the wind or something like that. So yeah, it's like just such a strange synchronicity between, and maybe it's not literally a synchronicity because this was like years later he was reading it, but it comes from the same root place. Jung theorized this collective unconscious that we're all tapped into, unconscious of, but we're tapped into it. And sometimes that collective unconscious makes itself known through these incredibly strange stories or synchronicities or precognitive happenings or something like that.
So fascinating. I love that he's like kind of a warm and like gentle enough person to like really hear out a schizophrenic and consider what they're saying. And then also simultaneously years later being deep in mystic text, you know, to get that connection. And he might have been in the tower reading those texts, which he builds.
Right. Yeah. And part of the reason, from my understanding, he hand builds this stone tower, which you can actually go to now. Like, you can go to Zurich and go to see his tower, and he's got all these just like cool carvings all over it, and like
he kind of had a monk mode period.
Yeah. He would go into the garden apparently and like talk to Philemon, like his wise man archetype. So if you read the Red Book ever, there's this character named Philemon who takes on this sort of wise old man archetype role, and he knows like everything. He's like Merlin or Gandalf or whatever. And yeah, he would apparently like walk around his garden and his tower and stuff and just talk to Philemon. But apparently
he lost his mind too. No.
Yeah, he was right in the sweet spot, it seems like. But yeah, he apparently hand built the tower because he was so deep into this like inner work that he needed something to physically tether him to the world. So he did like the hard work with his hands of like literally stacking thousands of blocks. Yeah, there's a great picture of him in like his work clothes with like goggles on, like has a pipe in his mouth, and he's just like stacking these big stones. Yeah, it's nuts.
And it's very like, how esoteric is that in terms of like the image of building your own tower? And he does it.
Yeah, and you got to wonder if there's like a Masonic parallel too, because I believe it's his grandfather was like the Grand Master of a lodge, of a Masonic lodge. And And obviously there's what they called, these are going to be the wrong words, but like mundane masonry and like operative masonry or like mystical masonry or something. And it was like, you really did do the work of building with your hands during the day, but then during the night when you would go to the fraternal meeting, you'd like build with your mind, and you would build like the soul with the like mystical knowledge or something. And it almost like, I wonder if that dawned on him, like, I need to do the building with my hands too, not just this stuff. I'm out of balance right now.
Sure. Kind of in the world, not of the world.
Yeah.
Little paradox. Yeah, I got in a Mason Wikipedia hole recently. You know, I've known about him forever, but it was kind of like, what? I need a refresher on the background. And it literally was like a stonemasons guild from the medieval times.
Yeah.
And who knows what else is beyond that, because a lot of powerful people are involved. But anywho.
Yeah, and they're super interesting because obviously they are supposedly carrying the torch of the Hermetic tradition, like their Hermetic order, and their own historical lore, which doesn't jive with like the mainstream, scholars, what they say where they say they came from and what their timeline is. But they believe that they're carrying the torch from like an ancient Egyptian, like Hermetic tradition that was around in antiquity. Like that's
Hermes Trismegistus.
Yeah. They believe that Hermes Trismegistus was like that there were these ancient Hermetic Masons, basically, that they have continued the tradition of.
Do you know the Hermetic principles?
That's a bunch of bullshit.
7 or whatever.
Yeah, I shouldn't say it's a bunch of bullshit, but the Kybalion is a modern text. It's billed as, I shouldn't say it's bullshit. I don't know how divinely inspired or not that it is.
There was a lot of early 20th century white dudes in Chicago that were writing as, and they're also, not surprisingly, in Christian and Gnostic, and there's a lot of guys and gals that were writing as the secret gospel of whatever.
Right.
And some people have even said, hey, what do you think about this, secret gospel of whatever? And you look it up and it's like, no, it wasn't found at Nag Hammadi. It was published by William Wallace.
And that's what we're looking at with the Kybalion.
1905.
It's like this there's this Theosophist New Age resurgence of all this wisdom happening. And it's really cool in a lot of ways, but it's also,
we can't know if
I don't like when it bills itself as ancient and it's like it's clearly a modern remixing or aggregation of ideas. But
no, that's legit.
Yeah. If you want to know the real Hermetic principles, read the Timmaeus and read which
is Plato's masterwork.
It is. Yes, it is. But also if you read the Timmaeus and then you go and read the Corpus Hermeticum, which are the direct Hermetic texts, you see that you're illiterate in what they're saying if you haven't read Plato. Like there's a clear transmission of wisdom through the Platonist tradition into the Hermetic tradition. And that's believed to be the timeline. But a lot of people, whenever I talk about Hermeticism, everybody's like, it's ancient Egyptian. It's really super ancient. But maybe it is, but that's not what scholars say. Like they say it's like the Alexandrian age syncretic combination of the Greek and Egyptian.
So Plato is proto-Hermetic.
Yes. That's the mainstream belief anyway.
He's not just Socrates' scribe.
Definitely not.
Which is not a bad gig, but we covered ancient,
completely covered,
some modern,
completely covered. Put a period on it.
We've culminated all wisdom, and I just really appreciate, you've talked to hundreds of people that vary in their specialties, from science to scholarship to history. So you've picked up on a lot of it, and I'm grateful to riff with you.
Thanks for having me, man. So it's always fun to riff. Time flew by, as always.
Absolutely. How can we absorb more of your wonder dips?
Just look up Third Eye Drops on YouTube or where you listen to podcasts.
Not on the shopping tab, because that is
not yet
a moisturizer.
Yes. Yeah, not on the eye drops, not the literal eye drops, because that is unfortunately a thing that comes up when you Google eye drops.
Awesome. Michael Phillip, appreciate you.
Of course, man.
May we all individuate.
Yes.